the YouTube channel in which we invite people of great achievement in the field of risk management and have conversations with them about what they have learned over the course of their careers about how to be successful in risk management. Today, we are pleased to welcome Douglas W. Hubbard. Doug is a consultant and author in the decision sciences and the inventor of applied information economics. He has also founded Hubbard Decision Research and is the author of, among other books, The Failure of Risk Management, Why It's Broken and How to Fix It, and How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. These are best-selling books in the field of risk management. Doug has taken a very interesting stance on risk management and its performance, challenging the risk management community on what many perceive to be its soft underbelly, namely quantification. We are very fortunate to get to discuss these views today and learn more about how risk management can be made to work better and ultimately improve decision making. Doug, thank you for being here. And
you bet, thanks.
What's it like to be in the vanguard of risk quantification? Has there been a big pushback or is it a big movement now?
Well, in a way, I guess I've been doing it for quite a few years, 2 or 3 decades, actually. So for me, it's been a very gradual process. I think I've had these discussions long before I wrote the books. I've had these discussions many times over. And that's actually why I wrote the books, is I kept seeing the same patterns of discussions about these things. The evidence of what works and what doesn't kept coming up. And the other thing that was happening in parallel is there was a lot of great research getting conducted on the comparative efficacy of different methods.
All right, we're very eager to learn more about these things, but what do you consider to be the biggest risk, Doug, if we start there?
Oh, yeah, well, that's the first question I ask. The single biggest risk, I think the answer should be the same across any industry or profession. The single biggest risk is how you're measuring risk. If that's flawed, if that's, suboptimal, it has a lot of weaknesses compared to alternatives that you could be using, obviously it's going to affect all your judgments about risk management in general. Where should you allocate resources to mitigate risk the most? That will be an uninformed, or at least less informed than otherwise could be, set of decisions. If that's kind of an apex risk. It's the one risk at the top of the pyramid that affects all the other risks. How we're even evaluating risk in the first place. What's our risk decision-making process?
Right, so you get decision-making wrong essentially if you're unable to incorporate risk into your decision model properly.
Yeah, and of course measure risk correctly in the first place, right? So how do some of these methods work, and how do we think we know they work? What's the basis for the confidence that we have in some methods? Is it well-founded? Those are the questions I keep asking.
Right. Yeah, and we'll see if we can arrive at some answers today. I'm sure we will. But what would you say is wrong with some of the current risk assessment methods?
Well, we've done some surveys on this, and clearly the most popular risk assessment method is the risk matrix, followed by some other qualitative, sort of pseudo-quantitative methods, where quantitative methods, things that statisticians and actuaries, quantitative portfolio managers would be more familiar with, those are the smallest subset. And even the 19 or 20% that say they follow quantitative, that's probably a generous upper bound, because we didn't actually ask people in the survey to justify their answer that they're doing quantitative analysis properly, or what we would call quantitative analysis. That's just the reporting of what they responded to in the survey. So 19 or 20%, probably an upper bound for the organizations actually conducting quantitative analysis. The majority tends to be, a slight majority is just the risk matrix. And again, the remainder is these other non-risk matrix, but still qualitative methods, the weighted scores and things like this. So a lot of your users will be familiar with this. A lot of your viewers, you see the 5x5 risk matrix. Sometimes it's 7x7. Apparently that's supposed to make it better in some way. But you'll see a score for likelihood, and a score for impact, and they'll rate them as unlikely or somewhat likely or extremely unlikely, or the impact is moderate or severe or critical. And sometimes they put intervals on them explicitly, like they'll say a low probability is less than 5%, and a moderate probability is 5 to 20% or something per year. Apparently, sometimes they don't even add the per year. It's just open-ended, like ever. Apparently, 20% chance of occurrence is meaningless without a time period attached to it. And then on the impact side, sometimes they might put intervals in terms of cost or public safety or human safety on those. The bottom line is, though, the research tends to show that those intervals aren't actually helping. They're not a good predictor of people's response patterns. People's response patterns on these scales are better predicted by just the number of points on the scale. So if number 5, or let's say on a 5-point scale, let's say number 1, the lowest risk was 5% or less. Mm-hmm. And let's say on a 5-point scale, that's chosen 20% of the time. Well, suppose somebody gets the idea that they need higher resolution, so they're going to go to a 10-point scale, but they're going to keep the lowest one the same. The lowest one is still going to just be less than 5%, but the rest are split up into finer increments, or maybe it goes out to a larger probability at the end or something like this. Maybe it goes further out. If people were really paying attention to the interval definitions, then you would expect that the same percentage of people would choose it on the 10-point scale, the 5% or less interval, as chosen on the 5-point scale. But that's not what we observe. That's called partition dependence. That study's been done multiple times, actually. That's a known phenomenon for people that design surveys and things like this, that the number of points on a scale is actually what people are paying attention to, even when people tell you they are paying attention to the definitions of the intervals. And there's several other issues that come up. Apparently, there's 2 problems with the use of verbal scales. One is the arbitrary choice about which verbal label to use makes a difference in people's responses, even though let's say you've defined the intervals exactly the same, but whether you call something unlikely or rare versus extremely unlikely, you could have used any of those terms to describe a particular interval, let's say. That apparently changes people's responses, at least as much as the defined quantities would. And at the same time, even though people might agree that something's unlikely, if you then debrief them afterward about how they interpreted that term in a particular context, they're all over the map. That's called the illusion of communication, and a couple of different researchers have observed that. In other words, you and I agree that something is unlikely or medium or yellow, and it turns out that we meant completely different things.
Yeah, I'm absolutely convinced you're right there. I mean, that we can interpret words differently is clear, and then we can, just as we would interpret colors differently, like the color red might signal a completely different level of risk to you compared to somebody else, right? So, but do you really? I mean, these are flaws in our decision making that the research has exposed. But do you really think that we collectively, as a group of people, as an organization, that we naively make decisions based on these rankings, and do they translate into, so where do you go wrong in actual?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons the risk matrix doesn't do more harm than it could is that people do routinely ignore it, or they retrofit the risk matrix to show what they were going to do anyway. So I think that's the safety valve, I think, is that sometimes common sense overrules. But then the question would be, why did we bother to make the risk matrix in the first place if we're just changing it, right? If we're just, what's the ROI on that process? Especially since we know other processes, which aren't necessarily more complicated, do show a measurable improvement. That's the real problem with it. It's not just that we're using a flawed method that might just be a waste of time. It's that there really are alternatives that show, actually in large clinical trials, a measurable improvement over unaided intuition. So why even bother with that at all?
Why bother? Yeah, that's a relevant question. But when you bring attention here to our unaided intuition, is that the right points of comparison here? Some would say that the merit of these methods that you are debunking here lies simply in getting people to have conversations about risk. That the real problem is not where our unaided intuition would take us, but rather there's too little attention on risk otherwise, and that these exercises are really only about getting those conversations going. Is there something to be said for that? Or?
Well, I'd like to see some data on people making the case that they actually don't have these conversations at all, but for that they're filling out a risk matrix. I can tell you one thing, though. People have much deeper and more substantive conversations with simple quantitative models.
Right.
We get asked all sorts of questions and all sorts of issues come up in simple quantitative models that no one ever thought to ask with the risk matrix. I'll put together a quantitative model that really isn't much more complicated than a risk matrix. It's still just subjective estimates of probabilities and then subjective estimates of the interval, a 90% confidence interval for some range of impacts, for example. That's a very simple quantitative model. Even if those are subjective inputs, there's research to show that that subjective estimation method can measurably outperform other subjective estimation methods. So being subjective itself is not the issue. But I've had people ask things like, how do we know we've included all the variables? Or how do we take account of the correlations between these events?
Right.
They never asked that in the risk matrix. This is when I'm presenting a quantitative model in an organization that had been using the risk matrix for a long time, and they never asked that question of the risk matrix. It only came up for the first time because we were using a quantitative model, and it just sort of forces more conversation. So if the primary objective is to force the conversation, you're definitely better off with a simple quantitative model, because people will ask all sorts of questions of the quantitative model they didn't ask of the qualitative model. They'll ask, well, how do we know we have enough data to justify those quantities? Well, first off, the qualitative models don't alleviate a lack of data. They just help you feel better about it. Right. So if the objective is anxiety reduction alone, then use whatever method, astrology or whatever, it reduces your anxiety. But if the objective is actually improved decision making, we should look at what the research shows where studies measured the performance of different methods for estimating things, which methods resulted in better estimates when you compared them to actuals over time, and which methods resulted in higher success rates of decisions, which portfolios had higher average returns of project portfolios, et cetera. I think the easiest one to look at is just improved estimates. It's very hard to look back and confirm whether some event was likely or unlikely, or severe or moderate, or a yellow or red or something. But we know exactly how to do the math when you say that something was 10% likely and it had a 90% confidence interval of, $1 million to $10 million loss. And you've done that a bunch of times, not just for that one event, but for many events over a period of time. And lots of other people have been doing similar things in other organizations. We know how to look back at the historical outcomes, compare them to original estimates, and make measurements about how effective the estimators were. So there's a lot of great data. Here's one area where we've got tons of data. We have all sorts of data about the performance of subjective estimates of experts.
So do we now? I mean, this is interesting that we actually have the right kind of data to make that sort of evaluation. So could we perhaps linger on this point a little bit? I mean, if you say that the probability of some event X is 5%, then neither is happening or it's not happening will disprove the method, right?
No, but that's not the way. You don't want to look at a single event. What you do is you look at all the times that a bunch of people said something was 5% likely. How often did it occur of all the times that it's 5% likely? Well, there's been a bunch of studies on this. We know quite a lot about it. We know that, say, for example, meteorologists, there's studies where there's thousands of data points for every probability. So all the times a meteorologist says there's a 5% chance of precipitation, if you look at the studies, some of the researchers were Winkler and a few others. If you go back to look at some of the research on this, it rained about or snowed about 5% of the time. Of all the times they said it was 5% likely. Of all the times they said it was 65% likely, it happened about 65% of the time. So looking at an individual event doesn't prove or disprove probability, unless somebody says they're 100% certain and they're wrong. Then you know for a fact they're wrong. In fact, here's another thing we know. Of all the times that experts trained in a given field said they were 100% likely, and this is true for disease prognosis, political events, technology trends, economics, etc. Of all the times that you observe experts saying they're 100% confident, they're right about 94% of the time if they were calibrated, if they went through calibration training, that is. If they weren't, it's going to be closer to 65, 70%. So that's extremely overconfident, right? You say you're 100% confident, you're an expert in the field, and you actually might have a 1 in 3 chance of being wrong when you say you're 100% confident. But after training, people are much more cautious about using, 100% confidence. But even then, we observe that looking at a number of different fields, they're right about 94% of the time, even though they've gotten a lot more cautious about using 100%.
Right. Yeah, it seems.
So that's an area where we've got tons of data. We've got all sorts of performance data on untrained and trained experts at providing estimates. So we should build on that.
So training matters here. We'll come back to that point, but just to recap your point there, you're saying focus less on a specific type of events. Rather, you should gather up all the instances where you have a certain probability estimate and look at how that performs. If you have, is that the?
Yeah, that's right. If somebody says something's 20% likely, and you want to gather a large number of those estimates, not just from that person, but from several people on several events. And if you see that a 20% likelihood for some event happening in 2021 was stated 100 times, well, then by the time we get to the end of 2021, we should observe that about 20 of those 100 events occurred. Right. And there's a way we can allow for some probabilistic uncertainty around that. And there's a way to compute what's a realistic range. But if somebody says they're 90% confident and they're only getting about 60% right, they're pretty far off. If they're supposed to get 90 out of 100 and they're getting more like 60 or 65 out of 100, they're definitely overconfident at that point.
Yes, there's absolutely room for lots of overconfidence here, and we have to be made aware of that. And it's reassuring to know that we do have data and ways to calibrate these things. And we'll come back to that. But before we leave these pseudo-scientific methods, as you refer them to, there's a sense in which they're still here and they seem mainstream now, and wouldn't you expect them to disappear if they didn't work, in the sense of evolutionary pressure weeding out bad methods?
Well, it took an awful long time for astrology to disappear. I mean, it didn't disappear. It's still around. I mean, so the problem with risk management in general, this is key that we have to understand about evaluating processes. It's not a field where we get immediate feedback. So how is it we're supposed to learn? In order to learn from our experience, we have to have relatively quick, consistent, and unambiguous feedback. And that's actually a conclusion from Daniel Kahneman and Gary Klein. They co-authored this paper together on this. And it makes sense. In order for us to learn from our experience, we need feedback. That feedback can't be highly delayed by years. It can't be feedback only a small percentage of the time. It has to be consistent, and it can't be unambiguous. So if somebody says a risk is yellow or something, that's ambiguous. If it happens or doesn't happen, you don't know how to compare it to your original outcome. On the other hand, if somebody says, I implemented a risk mitigation and the risk that was previously 10% likely per year went down to 4% likely per year, how many years would you have to observe that before, depending on your level of confidence that you wanted, before you were sure that you actually had a reduction in risk? Well, when you do the math, it's many decades, more than a century, actually, you'd end up waiting. So we don't get the immediate feedback, especially when we look at just the immediate experience of people looking at a given process in a given firm. What we do know is the existence of something called the analysis placebo. Now, I coined that term, but it's not based on research I've done. I'm just labeling a lot of research by other people that were in completely different areas, and they were coming to the same conclusion. It was observed by multiple authors who don't even cite each other because they're in completely different journals, by the way, that if you adopt a method that seems structured and formal, your confidence about your estimates and decisions will inevitably go up. Even if the measured performance is worse than it was before, you'll feel better.
Right.
So I call that the analysis placebo. It's not exactly the same as a medical placebo, but the idea is that the performance improvement is an illusion. You just feel better because you're going through a process that you think should work, so you believe it does, because it's structured and formal. A lot of your listeners may have heard something being called structured and formal as a benefit of that process, right? Is that a good thing, that it's structured and formal, and that alone ends up being an argument in favor of some process? Well, again, astrology is structured and formal. So why don't we adopt that, right? And just so no one's confused, I'm not promoting astrology. I'm using that as an example for why we shouldn't use the same validation processes in risk management as we do in other areas of human endeavors, right? So we don't get that immediate feedback. I would not expect that people would necessarily have dropped that risk matrix because they're not getting the feedback on their performance. You have to wait a long time, assuming it's being measured at all, and that it's measured unambiguously. You'd still have to wait a long time to observe if what you're doing is correct, unless you have such frequent risk that you get relatively quick feedback. Like, for example, Walmart could track shoplifting, and they do, right? And if you implement, security systems or whatever, and observe shoplifting going down, you could observe that in a couple of weeks, especially across all Walmart stores or something like this. So you get a lot of data really fast. But that's not really a risk, even though, for Walmart. That's just a cost control. You want to manage cost. It's such a reliable loss that you can effectively budget for it, just like people's salaries, right? So does it really even come up as something that a risk manager would include in a risk analysis? It's just a routine loss. I would argue that there's a good reason to believe it wouldn't count as a proper risk, right? Those kinds of very frequent small losses, right? It's a good debate to have, but I think where that threshold is probably above all those very frequent losses. So the kinds of things that people are really interested in modeling for risk are the more catastrophic and, by definition, infrequent events. And those are the very events you're not going to get quick feedback on. So how do we assess its performance, the performance of the methods? You do the same thing that my insurance company does when they evaluate my life insurance premium. I haven't died yet. So if you only look at my personal experience, you might say there is no data on Doug Hubbard's rate of death other than he hasn't died yet. So how does my insurance company do it? How do they evaluate the probability of me dying next year which I hope is a rare event, right? Well, they look at a large set. This is how we have more data than we think. I'm always telling people this. You have more data than you think. Look at a large set of more heterogeneous examples and interpolate, right? You don't have to find people that are exactly like Doug Hubbard. other 59-year-old men who don't smoke and have this body mass index and live in Glen Ellen, Illinois, and have 3 children and have my family history. I don't know if there is another one in Glen Ellen, Illinois, or in a much larger radius than that. I think, well, what they would do is they would just cast a much wider net and interpolate how to assess my mortality on a larger and more heterogeneous set of individuals. And we can do the same thing in any other risk analysis. You have to be able to ask questions like, well, how frequent are major data breaches that have to be publicized anyway?
Right.
How frequent are GDPR fines, right? Across all organizations. That can be an important baseline. Now, there might be reason for individual companies to believe that they're better or worse, but that can be a baseline where they would start out with. It's definitely not the case that they have no data. They have lots of data on them.
Right. And how do we get our hands on these all this wonderful data? I mean, is it do we have to engage with insurance companies or brokers or?
No, not at all. We tend to leverage data that's publicly available. So,
Right.
So there are sources for GDPR fines. It's public because it's a government administrated, fine system. So they publicize these things. HHS Wall of Shame in the U.S. is another public. If you lose more than 500 personal medical records of some sort, you get published on the HHS Wall of Shame. The advising data is not public, but people subscribe to it, and there are firms like Scientia that get their licenses for the advising data and do their own analysis. I've worked with them before. The National Vulnerability Database with the CVSS scores. Now, I'm not a big fan of scores in general, unless I find some empirical relationship between the scores and observed outcomes. And that research has already been done. We know what the relationship is between high severity scores on the National Vulnerability Database, the CVSS score, and the chance that a given vulnerability would be exploited.
Yeah.
So we know that. We also get the DBIR report and the IRIS report. The IRIS report is the one that's published by Scientia, and the DBIR report, of course, is the Verizon report. Those are free. The only one I talked about that isn't free is the advising stuff with Scientia, and that's plenty of data right there. The Veris database is what the DBIR report is based on, and that's all public. So right. Again, think of it like your insurance company doing a life insurance premium. You look at a larger set. Your own life is not your own basis of data, right? Otherwise, all we can conclude is that neither one of us has died yet. So how do we get all this data about our rate of death, right?
Yeah, I see the point, and as you say, I mean, companies are not called out for on their earlier estimates. It's a lot about this feel-good factor that it feels better to do something rather than nothing, right? And I think you can explain a lot of corporate activities that way. So when you're not called out, there's no incentive to leave behind this corporate-centric view, because I think you're right. I mean, firms are very much looking at their own specifics and try to quantify that rather than taking this broader vista that you're proposing, where there's suddenly lots of data available.
Oh, sure.
But how can you nudge people in that direction? Is it a matter of spreading the word, increasing the awareness of these? I'm sure this is what your books have been partly about, but.
Well, I think first off, I agree that one way to spread the word is write some books about it. So I'm trying to check those boxes. On the other hand, I think, it's a slow evolutionary change. It takes a long time for, just look at society as a whole. When did chemistry actually replace alchemy? Mm-hmm. It wasn't it didn't happen over a week. It kind of rippled out. When did psychology start to have more respect than astrology, right? In terms of explaining personality and so forth. That also, it's Even now, it's not completely replaced it. And psychology, of course, is not a perfect model either, because I mean, they're measuring humans and human behavior and things like this. So it's not going to be a perfect model, but it's measurably better than astrology. And the same is true with this. If you have a process where you don't get immediate feedback and accept that the one immediate feedback is that you feel better, that's the feedback you get. Right. And another analogy I use sometimes, it's sort of like you're in a part of the world where sometimes you get to experience cold, just like in Chicago, right? Right. I think so, right? So sometimes you get to experience extreme cold, and you know, if you're out in the woods and you're lost and it's snowing and you're experiencing hypothermia, maybe you have some brandy on you. And if you drink the brandy, you will feel warm. I've experienced this myself. I've been cold growing up in South Dakota. And if I drank, I felt warm. You know, if I'm out with friends at a frozen lake playing hockey or something like this, we would drink and you'd feel warm. But the feeling of warmth is actually your capillaries below your skin dilating, and you're actually radiating more heat. You're losing more heat. That's the warmth experience you're feeling, is you're losing heat faster. So if you were lost in the woods and you wanted to just feel better, you drink the brandy. But if you want to increase your chance of survival, you don't. That's the difference. I'm not judging anybody's objectives about which objective they should have. If they want to feel better and literally don't care about their chance of survival, keep using risk matrix. But if you don't just care about feeling better, but actually want to improve performance at estimating and decision making, et cetera, then, you know, don't use the risk matrix, use quantitative methods. By the way, here's another significant set of data that's already been gathered. Right. So starting all the way back to the 19th century in London, all of these insurance companies were coming into existence and going out of existence. It was like a big natural experiment. Right. Why were some insurance companies failing and failing so quickly and others surviving? It was, the ones doing the math were staying in business. And that was actually the beginning of actuarial science. Right. That's how it became a profession, is that, you know, it had to get developed as a practical science, you know, that was applied for decision making. So there's plenty of data on that. And now we have literally hundreds of studies comparing human expert decision making and estimations and estimates, human estimates, to simple quantitative models. And one researcher, Paul Meehl, after collecting more than 150, he had closer to 200 by the time he died, actually, just himself. I'm just talking about one of those researchers. There's other researchers that have done other large studies like this, but he had over 150 studies just himself, comparing human experts to statistical models. He said he could only find 6 where the humans did just as well or slightly better than the statistical models. And these are things like prognosis of liver diseases in cancer patients, the failure rates of small businesses, which married couples are more likely to get divorced. In each of these areas, there were human experts who thought that there would be no way that a simple equation could possibly replicate what they do. Well, that's true. The simple equations weren't replicating them. They were outperforming them. So that's another huge set of data we have. We have a lot of data on the relative performance of even relatively naive statistical models compared to unaided expertise.
And why do you think that is? Are we too biased as decision makers that we will extrapolate certain things that we have in the recent, a recent experience of, and so that we're or what's the reason?
Yeah, I think there's and given all the overwhelming research in favor of quantitative methods, I think one of the reasons is that there's a lot of misconceptions about quantitative methods. There's actually an effect. This is another researched effect. It's called setting up these experiments where he was comparing people who chose algorithms versus people who chose human experts and so forth. And he would also then show them their track record. And what he observed is that, and he would give people a chance to switch if they wanted to switch. What he observed is that when people were given the track records of the algorithms versus the humans, they were much more likely to switch from the algorithm to the humans than the other way around, even though the algorithms had fewer and smaller errors. So even though the algorithms had fewer and smaller errors, effectively what he concluded, people tend to hold a higher standard for algorithms. They expect them to be nearly perfect. And when they're short of that, they default to an even more imperfect, human source or qualitative source. And I think that's part of the big problem here, is that there's just a different standard. I'd mentioned before that people ask completely different questions of quantitative models that they would never have thought of asking of qualitative models. I've never seen anybody on a risk matrix say, how do I account for all the correlations between these events? They've never asked that. Of course, with a quantitative method, you can at least do that. You can actually include correlations if you want to do that, but that's a question that wasn't even asked of the qualitative models. So I think that's an important item, is that people tend to just hold algorithms to a higher standard, and when they don't meet that standard, they default to an even more inferior qualitative or subjective method. I think that's a key problem. That's kind of I call this the beat the bear fallacy, or the ex apero ursus fallacy in the books. Ex apero ursus is just Latin for beat the bear, and it's based on this joke you might have heard. Two guys are getting ready to go hike in the woods, and one guy's got running shoes on, the other guy's got hiking boots. The guy with the hiking boots says, "Why are you wearing running shoes?" He said, "Well, I heard there were bears in the woods today. I want to be able to run fast." His buddy with the hiking boots says, "That's absurd. You can't outrun a bear anyway." He says, "I don't have to outrun the bear. I just have to outrun you." Yes. Right? So that's the guy with the hiking boots was making the beat the bear fallacy. He thought the objective was to beat the bear. Well, here's a couple of things I'll mention to people. Have you ever heard somebody say that something's too complicated to model?
Well, about every day.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing, though. They're still modeling it. It might be based on their intuition. It could be a coin flip, could be astrology. They are still using a model, so that's not being avoided at all. They are modeling it. The other thing that we can say is that no models are perfect.
Right.
In fact, one famous statistician, George Box, gets quoted a lot. He says, essentially all models are wrong, but some are useful. I just point out that some are measurably more useful than others. So you're modeling anyway, and all models are wrong. So what's the real objective? Is to choose the modeling method that's less wrong. That's what we should look at. What's less wrong? Some have greater error than others. So if you're looking at the modeling methods that have less error, you end up looking at algorithms.
Right.
People make all sorts of other objections to the use of algorithms, like we don't have enough data for that. Again, the qualitative models don't alleviate a lack of data. In fact, we use probabilistic models because we lack perfect information, not in spite of it. That's why we use probabilistic models. And they don't have to be more complicated than what people are used to. They can start out very simple, and then when you decide that you want to start adding a lot more math and a lot more detail and including all these correlations and other things like this, you can do that with a quantitative model. And we have many times over.
Yes, it's just that the model forces you to confront some of these issues. Yes. Or you have to come up with actual numbers, and all of a sudden you're outside your comfort zone. So whereas not having a model leaves you can maintain the illusion that you are somehow going about.
Remember, you still have a model. Remember, you still have a model.
Yes, yes.
It's just a really ambiguous model, right? So more ambiguous models help us feel like we're not being put on the spot quite as much. So somebody would like to say it's entirely possible that X could happen, Or they might say it's 20% likely.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm not sure what entirely possible means. It's either possible or not, I suppose. But if somebody says it's entirely possible, no matter what happens, they feel covered. It doesn't happen, I said, well, I only said it was possible. It does happen. See, I told you it was entirely possible. It could happen. Somebody who says 20%, they might get judged on an event, that happened that they only gave a 20% chance to. They said, well, it happened, you only gave it 20%. But you can't judge on that one event. You have to, like we talked about already, you have to look at several events, many events. Look at all the events where somebody said something was 20% likely. Did it happen about 20% of the time? Research on calibration trained individuals, so you can calibrate individuals to be very good at assessing probabilities. The research tends to show that yes, you can train people so that over a number of trials, they're actually estimating events that occur as often as the frequencies they apply.
Right, and this is important, but you're saying that, well, you're suggesting methods whereby we can improve our estimates, we can calibrate them, we can train ourselves and come up with more valid inputs. But what kind of methods are you proposing when it comes to actual decision making? Because the real decision making situations are very complex. Let's say we're pondering a market entry into making a risky investment, and what's that model supposed to look like? Could you describe
Sure.
how we frame these decisions?
Yeah. Well, remember, again, we have to go back to, you don't have to have a very complex quantitative model to easily outperform the qualitative alternatives. And by the way, when I say qualitative, I'm not saying we're not going to use other qualitative methods like brainstorming. Mm-hmm. Sometimes people come up with a straw man argument and say, well, of course, you always start with qualitative when you brainstorm, so therefore qualitative works. We're not excluding brainstorming and the higher cognitive aspects of identifying solutions and things like this. I'm not saying there's algorithms for that. I'm just saying that when it comes to the point where we try to express our uncertainty and synthesize our experience and communicate those in some meaningful way that's meant to inform decisions, those should be based on algorithms as opposed to the pseudomath and so forth. Okay. So the thing about complex decisions, though, you can make a quantitative model as complex or as simple as you want. You don't have to make them very complex to easily outperform the other alternatives, though. That's why I give away some spreadsheets on the websites like howtomeasureanything.com/cybersecurity or /risk management. You can download this one table. It runs a Monte Carlo simulation. Mm-hmm. I call it the one-for-one substitution model because it's the simplest Monte Carlo simulation I could think of that directly substitutes a risk matrix. Mm-hmm. Each dot on a risk matrix becomes a row in this table. You still subjectively assess a likelihood and an impact, but now they're unambiguously quantitative, right? Mm-hmm. First, you have to get calibrated, though. People should get calibrated so that they know what their performance is at estimating probabilities, right? So we measure your performance at estimating probabilities, and we measurably improve it during the training. So once you're calibrated, you know what your skill is at estimating things. There's even algorithms for combining experts. That's the neat part. We're working on that whole new solution now. That's about ready to go beta here in, this next week, actually. So there's algorithms for how you combine the quantitative estimates for probabilities from multiple experts. And some algorithms for combining experts measurably outperform other algorithms. That's really neat. So your best algorithms for combining experts are better than your best individual expert. Your best expert is the aggregate sum of your experts in the right algorithm. That's the neat thing. You're modeling it anyway. You're leaving out some complexities. No matter how you're modeling it, you're leaving out some complexities. If somebody asks me, how do I know I have all the variables in this model? I go, well, I don't. Obviously, it's a model. If you had a model that was perfect, we wouldn't even call it a model. We'd call it reality. So remember, you're modeling, and you're never going to have a perfect model. So the only question is which modeling method is less wrong. Mm-hmm. So again, if somebody says, you can't capture every aspect of my decision-making quantitatively, therefore I'm going to default to a risk matrix, that's irrational. That makes no sense. Choose the better modeling method. We know which modeling methods measurably outperform others. We should rely on that research.
It's certainly good to have science on your side, the data on your side. Mm-hmm. But don't you run into the fact that people you say that these methods are only marginally more complex, or maybe not more complex at all, but that seems to be what most people think, that they don't have the qualifications to do this. People are rarely in the mood for advanced statistics or see themselves as having the qualifications to do this. Is that a problem here, that finding the right people to even do this sort of thing, take these extra steps?
Well, for most moderately large firms, they easily justify somebody specializing in this, right? Many of them are already paying people as risk management executives or of one sort or another. They're just not paying those salaries to people with some quantitative background that can do even simple quantitative models. Again, you don't need a very complicated model to do this. We train people in just a day or two, to do these things. And you could, if somebody went to the website howtomeasureanything.com and downloaded that first spreadsheet with the simple Monte Carlo simulation, the instructions at the top of the spreadsheet are almost good enough to get you going. Of course, you want to improve on that by, you need to learn to be better at subjectively assessing probabilities in order to populate this thing. But it's already an improvement simply because it avoids some of the errors that are introduced by the qualitative scores, like the range compression and partition dependence that I mentioned earlier, the ambiguity that I mentioned earlier. Uncertainty is unavoidable. You're going to have uncertainty, but ambiguity is always avoidable. We can always better state what we mean by something. What do you see when you see more of it? How do I know X is true, right? How do I justify my current state of uncertainty about it? And what's a realistic way to just state my uncertainty? There's actually just a few tricks that we use in calibration training, which I also describe in the books. Mm-hmm. You can get better calibrated just by observing what the methods I talk about in the books. But apparently, pretending to bet money makes people better at assessing probabilities. There's been studies on this. Actually betting money is not much better than pretending to bet money. But just pretending to bet money makes everybody better estimators. So that's one of the methods we actually teach, is we show them how to set up estimation problems as a simple hypothetical betting game. And they start getting better right away with that, just on that one improvement.
So they focus their minds in a different way on the problem, is that, or they start believing in themselves, or what's going on?
Yeah, they learn some techniques, and then we go through an iterative process where they do an exercise, they get feedback, they do another exercise, they get feedback, and they get to see, of all the times I said something was 80% likely, did it happen 80% of the time? Did about 90% of the answers show up within my 90% probable range? Mm-hmm. They get that immediate feedback. You don't get that as a risk manager. You don't, when you state a probability, you're not going to get feedback on that minutes later, like we do during the training. In fact, I would say that in calibration training, you get more feedback to affect your estimation skills than many people would get their entire career. I mean, they never get the feedback, certainly not in a very short period of time, which is, as we mentioned earlier, is when it makes the most difference. You have to get it relatively immediately. Mm-hmm. They can't wait years for the feedback, even assuming that you are measuring it and documenting it. Documentation of these estimates is a really important thing too, because people actually remember making different estimates than what they did. Mm-hmm. They remember being right more often than they really were.
Right.
And for two reasons: they selectively recall when they were right, and sometimes they believe they estimated something differently. Mm-hmm. When in fact you document it. Psychologists have done this research too. They find out that people believe they estimated something one way. It was always in the way that ends up making them right. When in fact they were documented as saying something different. And they are more likely to remember, when they do recall correctly, they're more likely to recall the situations where they were right rather than they were wrong. So that's why we all believe we're above average forecasters.
Yeah, we're always creating these stories in our favor, right? We're all better drivers, better lovers, better anything, you know.
Oh,
so
yes.
It's
Yeah, everybody is above average because we all remember when we're right more often than we're wrong. But we do remember when other people are wrong more frequently. Difference.
Goes back to these the biases we suffer from as decision makers, unaided by quantitative models. But once you set up your models, isn't that introducing another sort of hubris that we're now overconfident because of the model? Like, it seems so perfect now, and we have done all these things, and how can the model go wrong now? And you end up in a situation where maybe that becomes the risk, that everyone will assume the model is right because, you know, it's been checked and we're using all these techniques, and only to be, you know, blown away by some black swan type of event that was outside the model. Is that a threat here that we can?
Yeah, well, first off, I don't believe any models. Yeah. I never believe a model. Models, this is another famous statistician quote, models are to be used, not believed. Yes. So I don't believe in models. And if you're doing a probabilistic model, and if you're well calibrated, you're almost never perfectly certain. I had someone yesterday estimate, I was having a discussion on LinkedIn. Somebody said they were 99.9% sure that China would not do X, some kind of a military aggression of some sort, broadly defined, in the next 12 months. I don't know, even if I studied that field for many years, and in fact, if I was the leading expert in that field, could I still be 99.9% confident about anything? Mm-hmm. I just got done showing that when people are experts in their field, and they've been calibrated, of all the times they said they were 100% confident, they're only right 94% of the time. Mm-hmm. So I'm not 100% confident in anything. I'm barely 99.9% confident in known laws of physics, because I'm pretty sure that some of them will be overturned at some point in some way, just like Newtonian laws and so forth, right? So I can't, even though every time I turn on my computer, I'm doing dozens of physics experiments, right? Every time I turn it on. So there's lots of physics that must be working, but is it exactly right? I can't be 100% sure. Any physicist would tell you that too, right? You can't be 100% sure of some of those things. So that's one item, is that if someone's becoming super confident or certain in a model because it's a model, then they haven't learned the lessons of probabilistic modeling. You're not supposed to be 100% certain in something. Your confidence is gained through measurement and observation and the performance of models. The past performance of models should tell us something about the confidence we should have in models. But I'll also add something about what you mentioned about black swan events. This is a classic algorithm aversion issue, because a black swan event occurs. Somebody points at a quantitative model and says, see, that quantitative model failed to predict a black swan event. And I say, well, how well did you predict it? Mm-hmm. If you have two modeling methods and they both fail to predict a black swan event, then it's not a differentiator between the models. You have to look at all the other events, right? You can't just look at the events that one model didn't predict and then assume that another model is better. One model predicts events better than another model. It never has to be perfect. It's just better than the other model. It's less wrong than the other model. Right. So, and remember, that's the only criteria we care about.
I think that makes a lot of sense, but I have also seen how it can be hard to win people over to quantitative modeling. But once you do and you prove yourself to some extent, it tends to become the new house god, so to speak. They will just, if the model says the company is safe, will survive with 99% confidence, everyone will assume that's true, and maybe they will not commit as much capital, to keep the company safe, etc. Whereas a different kind of conversation might lead to a different decision, where you start maybe by thinking, what do we need to never fail as a company, and you build up that resilience. So,
right.
So you start with your vulnerability or your fragility rather than your simulated probabilities, and
yeah, but what's vulnerability and fragility even mean other than some amount of probability, right? What if we say that something is more fragile than something else, or less risky than something else? What do we mean specifically? The only way we can actually quantify that or even speak about it in any useful terms is to put probabilities on those things. Mm-hmm. So yes, we should speak in terms of probabilities because that's a mathematically unambiguous way to express our uncertainty. If somebody says they're perfectly certain and they say, well, here's some people who used a quantitative model and they were perfectly certain and they ended up being wrong, therefore quantitative models are wrong, I think they're taking away the wrong lesson. When you might recall a story of Sir Eddington making the measurements of stars near this behind the sun during the eclipse to confirm Einstein's model, right? Mm-hmm. Now, when he observed that starlight was being bent, did they get rid of math in physics? No, they did not. They updated the math. They updated the models. They improved the quantitative models. And that's the way we should think about things. Sure, there's always room for improvement in quantitative models. We should think in terms of continuous improvement for quantitative models. That's a valid point. And I never believe a model with 100% certainty. If it has any human estimates in it at all, and if they're calibrated, they can't be 100% certain.
Right. No, that's a very good point, and I agree. I just recall the days before the Lehman Brothers crash, when the risk manager of one of these, now defunct institutions said, he went on record saying that, look, nothing's going to happen here. We're safe. The model is showing green lights here, and a few days later they were gone. So they had kind of substituted, proper or real thinking with whatever the model said, and that's a dangerous place to be, right?
I guess the question to ask is, why do we think he wouldn't have said that without a quantitative model?
That's your point.
Secondly, what makes us so certain that he was even using a quantitative model or using it correctly? If you use a quantitative model that shows the history of stock market experience, how can you possibly be 100% certain in any organization? I think there's a lot of errors. I remember in my second book, I was interviewing hedge fund managers too, and their standard approach to analyzing volatility was to look at the last 3 years. Mm-hmm. So when they're doing things like they're measuring the correlation between different international currencies, for example, or the likelihood of major stock market changes or something like this, or just the general volatility, they tend to look at the past 3 years or so because they are working on the belief that only recent history is informative, that things are different now, and I can't go back, 50 or 100 years because that's less relevant. Mm-hmm. Well, it turns out it's not. It's not less relevant to go back many decades, at least 50 years in the stock market. That's a better predictor of major events occurring. So we can't keep saying it's different this time and then keep getting proven wrong. A historical analysis couldn't possibly have justified 100% confidence in anything. I do quote the CFO of Goldman Sachs prior to the financial crisis. And he said, what did he say? It was something like some absurd number of standard deviations away, that we, the stock market was showing something happening of 10 or 20 standard deviations variation several days in a row. And if that was really true, and I did the math, and I have a PowerPoint slide on this where I said, well, what does that many standard deviations mean multiple days in a row? It means that is smaller than 1 divided by the national debt of all the countries in the world, measured in yen, and divided further by the number of bacteria on planet Earth, divided further by the number of atoms in the observable universe. It's like 1 over 10 to the 130th or something like that, 120th or something. And his estimate, if he was that many standard deviations off, would still be off by a factor of 1 trillion, even though you brought it down to that tiny, astronomically small number. Clearly, he wasn't using a quantitative model based on any substantive history, if he was coming up with that level of confidence in things. People have made all sorts of, there's people who've trained to be pilots and flown into mountains. We don't say, well, clearly aviation doesn't work because somebody flew a plane into a mountain. They did it wrong. Can't we say that? Can't we say they did it wrong? If somebody is doing probabilistic modeling, and except in very rare cases, they would say, if they ever said they were 100% certain, they're doing it wrong. They're not using a probabilistic model. The only thing you can be 100% certain in is a mathematical proof. And even then, I'm not sure I didn't make a mistake. Einstein said that insofar as we know something for certain, it doesn't apply to reality. Insofar as it applies to reality, we don't know it for certain. He was making the comparison between theoretical mathematical physics versus experimental outcomes. And the same is true with the real world, the rest of the world. Physics is the real world, but also the financial decision-making world and that sort of thing. In each of those cases, there are things we could be absolutely certain about, which are abstractions. But when it comes to the empirical reality of the world, we have to have uncertainty. That's the flaw that non-modelers make, right? And again, who's to say, and I seriously doubt, another thing that I interviewed the hedge funds about is program trading and quantitative models. Right. A lot of people blamed quantitative models, like the Gaussian copula model and options theory and modern portfolio theory. They were blaming those for the financial crisis. I didn't find one investor that followed quantitative models religiously. They said they used them as guidelines, and they routinely, according to what they called their common sense, would override those models. And there's a huge qualitative decision even in firms that use quantitative models. They have a series of program trading algorithms, and they decide qualitatively which ones to enact, because different algorithms will be based on different kinds of models to things. And they say, well, I'm going to run model 127, and then it's time to switch to model 94, right? So they're switching back and forth between models based on subjective judgment. So it would be hard to lay the blame at the feet of quantitative models, because first off, a proper use of quantitative models wouldn't have put 100% confidence on any of those events. We know for a fact that 5% single day price drops in the Dow Jones and the S&P 500 happened dozens of times in the 20th century. Right. Even though a Gaussian model might say, well, it's a once in 1,000-year event. No, it's happened dozens of times in 1 century. So it can't be right. I think algorithms get a lot of blame where they weren't even being used. Yeah, they are. They do have a bit of a bad rep in some quarters, and I would say some executives, if you take the perspective of an operating firm, they have learned the hard way not to trust their Excel models, because there we are usually talking Excel models, right? They have build those models for decision support. And if we're now saying that we're going to attach uncertainty estimates to these decision support models to capture some range of outcomes and have some factor risk into the analysis, they would be skeptical for the very simple reason that the Excel model, they don't trust that one. And I've seen so many, I'm sure you have as well, models that are full of errors, and the process is sometimes terrible, where
multiple people can just start, messing about with the model and change it, and there's no,
Yeah. Well, there are better.
And why would you then trust your simulations if that is what you're starting with?
Yeah. Well, first off, if you weren't previously doing probabilistic models at all, even if they were quantitative, but they weren't probabilistic, of course, you end up not trusting them. So it's not that you should be less confident in probabilistic models, because there's already research that shows, I actually cite some of this research in the books, research that shows that people who build Monte Carlo simulations are better on average at forecasting outcomes than people who don't. That's the thing you should be concerned about, right? Is that just the process of decomposing our sources of uncertainty makes us better at estimating things. So yes, even simple quantitative models outperform our subjective judgment. The other item, though, I think I would probably add to the conversation is, even though subjective models, quantitative models can be misused, I think that's just a bad comparison. I tried brain surgery once and a guy died. I'm not a brain surgeon. I'm not saying this is anywhere near as complicated as brain surgery, by the way. But if somebody tries something they're not really qualified to do, or are using modeling methods, deterministic modeling methods, which are guaranteed to disappoint.
Yeah.
Right. If you have a model that says this investment is going to have a net present value of $15.98 million, the only thing I can tell you for sure is it's not going to be that. Right. That's not the value of it. So yes, we don't judge any model by the bad examples. Go and let's do the research, look at the research that's been done, not do the research. We just have to look at the existing research on controlled experiments where people have set up various versions of quantitative models against the unaided intuition versus other qualitative models, and observe the outcomes. None of them are always right, but some are less wrong than others, and it's the quantitative models.
No, I very much agree, and just for to come clean here, I'm very much in favor of quantitative models and
oh yeah, I understand.
I'm just bringing up certain.
Yes. You're pointing out those objections.
Right?
I try to go through there. I learned a new term here, even just the last couple of weeks. I guess it's been something I've been doing for many years, but I've read some psychology research on the concept of refutational instruction. So it was addressing ways to teach psychology and also statistics. That if you're a professor and you're teaching statistics, one of the things you have to know is that your students are coming to your class with a bunch of misconceptions already. The typical assumption is that if I just teach them how it works, they'll drop those misconceptions. That's apparently not a good bet. They keep those misconceptions in many cases really indefinitely unless they're specifically refuted. So refutational instruction is where you start out with what you guys currently believe. Now let me explain why that's wrong. So that's kind of what my books have been about, really, is refutational instruction. I try to address directly, not just here's the right way to do things or here's an improved way to do things, but why are your current beliefs incorrect, right? You've heard people say things like, we can't use these quantitative methods for that measurement because that was measured without a statistically significant sample size. You've heard that, statistically significant sample size? That's not a thing. There is something called statistical significance. There's something called sample size, but you cannot compute statistical significance based on only knowing the number of samples. You have to have a hypothesis. You have to compute a p-value from the actual values, not just the number of the samples, but the values they have. And then you have to compare that p-value to a significance level. Right. And if the p-value is less than the significance level, you determine that it's statistically significant. But then after you've gone through that whole process, people should learn, hopefully, that it doesn't even answer the question you thought it was answering. It doesn't even mean probably true or probably false.
Right.
You can have a very informative finding that's not statistically significant, and one that is, it told you nothing that you didn't already know.
Right.
Okay. I wrote a paper about that in the American Statistician. I co-authored it with a statistician from Iowa State University, and we did a Bayesian proof of how to interpret the probability that hypotheses are true based on outcomes of studies and the replication rates of studies in that field. Because you can't do it by looking at a single paper. I can't compute the probability a hypothesis is true. Technically, they're only computing the probability that you would see that effect or something more extreme given that the null hypothesis is true. That's what they're really doing. It's not the probability a hypothesis is true given the data. But what we can do is if we look at the replication rates in a whole field, we can make some inferences about that. And it turns out that in many fields like clinical psychology, when a study comes out and says that this is a statistically significant result, not the sample size is statistically significant, but the result is statistically significant. That's different. That only really means almost a 50-50 chance of being true.
Right.
The hypothesis. And when it's replicated, then it gets over 90% chance of being true. Right. That's what we were able to show in that Bayesian proof, which I think is interesting by itself. We should just start looking at all academic research applied to practical policy decisions that way. We should look at it what's the probability the hypothesis is true? Well, let's see what the replication rate success is for that field, et cetera. That's what you need to look at. Yeah, I think that's one of many misconceptions. People will say things like correlation is not evidence of causation. Mm-hmm. You've heard that one?
Absolutely.
Well, it's not proof of causation, but it is evidence of it, and I show a proof of that. Mm-hmm. I have show a proof that even though it's not proof, it's evidence of causation. Mm-hmm. So yeah, there's a number of misconceptions. Even the idea when someone says, we don't have enough data to measure that. Mm-hmm. You've heard that one?
Sure thing.
Yeah, that's a very specific mathematical claim when you think about it. Mm-hmm. When someone says we don't have enough data to measure that, did they actually compute the uncertainty reduction that you would get from a given amount of data and maybe compute the economic value of that uncertainty reduction to get the data or do the analysis if they needed it? No, they're winging it every time. There's all sorts of baggage that people are taking into this conversation that we have to debunk. And I guess that's kind of what I've been trying to do with the books, is what now I've learned to call refutational instruction. You have to refute the misconceptions.
Mm. Yeah, there are plenty of those out there, and they seem to thrive in the context of risk quantification. But what would you have me do as if I'm an executive in an organization and I want to have better decision support tools? You know, what to summarize the methods that you believe work. What's the sort of sequence here? Where do we start, and how do we set up the this process?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, not to sound like we're just pitching our own services, but that's exactly what we do, so that, but in order to give people alternatives so they don't feel like the only way to do it is to call us at Hubbard Decision Research. But we treat that like a turnkey project. We just come in and we do a scoping call. We do the whole thing. On the other hand, there really are a lot of qualified quants out there in the world.
Right.
There are plenty of people that can do this. And sometimes there's people that have a good quantitative background, but they're not familiar with this particular area. We sell training for that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. We don't have to do the whole project. We just can do the training. But even so, there's a lot of decent consultants and consulting firms that can set these sorts of things up. And there's people that you can hire that had a good decision analysis, Monte Carlo simulation background. Mm-hmm. Decision analysis is the key term you want to look for. Not necessarily just data science, and maybe not even just statistics, but decision analysis, okay? They have to use probabilistic methods. And if they ever bring up something like rate this on a scale of 1 to 5 or high, medium, low or something like this, they're not talking the right language. Right. You got to pass on them and go to the next one. I don't even try to convince most people. Like most new technologies or new methodologies, you try to convince the leading edge. Mm. So there's going to be a group of leaders that will adopt things first, and then they'll kind of blaze the trail for everybody else. I think we're at a stage, even though that lots of people have been promoting quantitative methods for quite a while, we're still at a stage where we have to convince more people, but I don't feel like we have to convince everyone to succeed. Some people, just like the insurance companies in 19th century England, they'll fail or succeed. The natural experiment will show that they'll fail or succeed based on who's doing the math.
Yeah, but there's also simultaneously there's this corporate ethos that says, keep things simple. And this whole risk management community for some reason seems to be surprisingly non-quantitative in its outlook, and that's one of the things that surprises me, that this enterprise risk management community, for example, they seem rather hostile to models in general, which is surprising.
Like I keep saying, they're not hostile to models. They like their own models just fine. Yeah. Their models might be, again, their own unaided intuition or qualitative methods, but they have a model, right? Yeah. So that's never the question. But we should ask why people feel threatened by those things. Mm-hmm. Why do we think? I think it's pretty obvious. Why do people feel threatened by any new methodology? They always feel threatened because they don't think that they're in a position to really adopt the new method. I don't think it's that hard. We've trained people. I had one client a few years back that was in the entertainment industry, and they were adopting quantitative methods to prioritize portfolios of lots of different projects. Right. Not all technology projects, some of them entertainment projects. And these were all theater majors and people like this, and they're doing brilliantly. I don't know why anybody would think that they can't handle it. I was training music and theater majors. Music majors, you might have heard, are already a little bit better at math in general, but maybe for some people they don't necessarily associate theater majors with that. But somehow people with accounting degrees or something like this they feel stumped by this stuff. Right. I just don't think it's as hard as people imagine. There's a quote from Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he says, successful people are those who are willing to spend 20 minutes figuring out something that other people give up on immediately. Right. I think that's it. I think they're just giving up on it. They're not even spending 20 minutes on it. They just categorize it as something I can't do, so I'm going to turn the page. Right. I guess I don't think that way. There's plenty of times I'm reading some very dense technical material and I look at a page of content that I know is going to be challenging because that's what I gravitate toward. But I don't just turn the page just because I think it's going to be too challenging. I try to figure it out. In almost any field, I try to figure it out. I'm not saying I succeed every time, but I don't just pass on it because I don't want to expose my own ignorance to myself. I dive right into it. And I think that's the solution here. That's a good rule for anybody's career at any stage in your career, unless you're ready to retire tomorrow, and live in a hut in the Bahamas or something like this. Unless you're ready to do that, there's room for improvement and in fact, even if and when I ever do retire, I'm going to make my retirement decisions based on quantitative methods, as I have already. Because my retirement model is actually a lot more detailed than the model that our money managers use. So I eat my own dog food.
No, I hear you and I agree, absolutely. And I think the learning process that you get from engaging with quantitative models can be superb. I mean, it's just very enlightening to have to formalize all these relationships, and you discover so much, and it's an incredible learning, journey. And that fact alone, I think, calls for,
oh, sure.
To do this.
Well, I'll add one more thing to that too. Where else has complexity been such a big issue for organizations? Mm-hmm. You look at the CEO of any organization, that CEO is not an accountant plus a lawyer plus an engineer, right, plus a data scientist or whatever other, or software developer, full stack developer, or cybersecurity expert. They're never experts in every single field that they hire people for. They hire people for those fields. Why is this any different? Right? It shouldn't be seen as any different. It's just another field where it's not that complicated, but insofar as it is complicated, there are people who specialize in that. Mm. Just like everything else in the organization, there's different people specializing in different problems. I don't know all of the state and country regulations and human resources. I'm never going to be that person. Right. So I'm never going to be a lawyer. I'm never going to be a corporate lawyer. I'm not going to be that person. We all specialize. The complexity issues is not a real issue. It's a way for some people to avoid the question.
Yeah, but maybe I should disagree just a little bit here for the sake of the discussion.
Okay.
I mean, I do think I mean, if you get the right people, you can definitely make a lot of progress in very short amount of time and improve vastly your decision support tools. But there's also some scope here for creating models that are horribly misleading, I would say, if you don't know what you're doing. I mean, we're talking about accumulating uncertainty over a corporate planning horizon, which could be many years. And there's just seems to be, if you're not really familiar with the way, you know, how to model uncertainty and how to make it accumulate over time in a way that, you know, hangs together with basic principles. I mean, the estimates can end up being off the charts, you know, completely wrong, and
Sure.
if you don't have certain, you know, basic set of skills here,
and we have plenty of evidence of that, because that's exactly what happens with all the qualitative models, right? These errors accumulate over time. So remember, there's lots of different methodologies where errors are going to accumulate, and periodically those models will be far off. But again, I have to direct people back to the question: how does it compare between the qualitative model versus the quantitative model?
right?
And which specific quantitative model? Because sometimes people's objections to quantitative models is they can name a bad quantitative model. And that's not what we're doing here. We're not just saying, well, there are no bad quantitative models. That's not the basis of my claim. My basis of my claim is, if people adopt relatively simple quantitative models, ones that are actually kind of hard to mess up, but relatively simple quantitative models, they're measurably outperforming unaided intuition. And we also know that the qualitative models themselves actually add error to the unaided intuition. So again, there's a straw man argument to make to say that because I'm promoting quantitative models, therefore there are no quantitative models with errors in them. Well, of course they do. They have errors. Again, it's only about which ones have less error, which one's less wrong, right? So yeah, I keep circling back to that point when someone says, I know this one quantitative model was wrong this one time by a lot. I go, yeah, I'm sure there's plenty.
Yeah, it's good that you're repeating this very important point, that we're always benchmarking against the qualitative model, which where these very large errors go unnoticed or they're not talked about, and they're never called out. So I mean, that's important, and it's good that you repeat that. But I mean, the danger again might be that the quantitative model will present itself as the bringer of some truth, and it will have a very precise number for you and some kind of claim to being superior.
Yeah, well, I guess that's the other. Yeah, I guess that's the other issue then. We also should not judge any model by how one group or another misperceives it.
Yeah.
The fact that there are people who misunderstand a quantitative model, certainly they definitely misunderstand a quantitative probabilistic model if they think that means they can be certain.
Yeah.
If it's a probabilistic model, how did they end up being certain? Unless all the probabilities are 100% certainty, right? So if it's a probabilistic model, they should by definition not be certain about it in the first place. So yes, we could quote unquote debunk modern medicine by using the example of a person who rejected the advice of a doctor.
Yeah.
So yeah,
yes.
So people would say, well, I didn't do what the doctor said, therefore modern medicine is wrong. Well, no, you're not doing what the model said. If it's a probabilistic model and you're certain, well, then you didn't interpret what the model said. It reduced our uncertainty compared to what our uncertainty would have been without it, right? Exactly. Here's another really important thing that quantitative models help us do, though. We can compute the value of additional information. If we're explicit about our uncertainty, we can compute the monetary value of reducing uncertainty. Even if you have dozens or hundreds of uncertain variables in a model, you can compute the economic value of reducing uncertainty on each one. In fact, that's the reason for the name applied information economics. You mentioned earlier that credited me for developing this applied information economics method, but that's the reason why I called it that is because all we're doing is systematically computing the information value on each uncertain variable in a decision.
Okay.
And then we're conducting empirical measurements. So it's not just about the modeling.
Yes.
Modeling is one stage where we quantify our current state of uncertainty, compute the value of additional information, and then go out and conduct measurements. And this is important because it turns out that without actually computing the value of information, most organizations are measuring the wrong things. I mean, completely wrong. They spend more time measuring things with, on average, lower information values than things with higher information values. The things that they spend the most time measuring are the least likely to improve decisions, and the things that are the most likely to improve decisions get almost no attention at all. Within software development, what do you think they spend more time measuring, cost or benefits?
Well, whatever they can claim the most expertise in or the most verifiable thing. So maybe.
Well, most of my clients would say cost. They spend more time measuring cost. And then I ask them, what's more uncertain, cost or benefits? They always say benefits. And I can make it more granular. I can say within cost, what do you spend more time measuring? Initial development or long-term maintenance and training? They always say the first. Which one's more uncertain? Which one's bigger? The latter. Uncertain and bigger. The latter. That's called the measurement inversion. That people are not just measuring the wrong things, they're measuring almost exactly the wrong things. And the only way it seems that we can avoid the measurement inversion is actually explicitly compute the value of information. It's been part of decision theory and decision analysis for quite a few decades now, so it's not a new thing. We do add some additional meat to that by showing how you can compute it for every uncertain variable in a big decision model. Yes. And we've got a lot of empirical data now about where the high information values typically are. That's the measurement inversion observation. So that's the other side of this. Our models of uncertainty allow us to figure out where to reduce our uncertainty.
Right. Yeah, this is important. We're apparently drawn to areas where we can feel a little bit like experts, or have some certainty, or where we are able to verify, the inputs to some extent, but that could lead the focus very wrong, right? And I think that goes for a lot of risk, quantitative risk modeling efforts as well. That people seem to, take it upon themselves to model, let's say, credit losses or exchange rate losses, and they bring all these tools to bear on those issues, but whereas the company's real risk, is related to something else, like a pandemic or some downturn in the business cycle, or so they were doing a stellar job quantifying these risks according to the state of the art. But the only reason they were there doing that sort of thing is because that's where they had the data and they could feel like that this is something we have a grip on. So they were completely blind to. So do you see a tendency here that we gravitate towards things that lend themselves to quantification rather than where we should be, and the things we should be talking about? Is that a?
Well, I do agree that people spend more time measuring things which they know how to measure.
Yeah.
But I'm proposing that's not the approach we default to. We shouldn't default to that approach. Right. Instead of just measuring what we know how to measure, first figure out what we should measure. Right. And if it turns out we need to measure something we're unfamiliar with, that's even more uncertain. That's why it had a higher information value, is the model is sensitive to it and there's lots of uncertainty. That would tend to have a high information value. So if you've got a big consequential decision and there's a variable that the decision is highly sensitive to and it's a highly uncertain variable, it's going to have a high information value. So if you end up measuring that thing, if you end up determining that's a thing that with a high information value, that's what you should measure. Now, here's a kind of a paradox, though. It's not really a paradox, but it's a seeming paradox. Sometimes people think that when something has a lot more uncertainty, you need a lot more data to measure it because it's uncertain. Mathematically speaking, just the opposite is true. The more uncertainty you have, the easier it is to measure because it's uncertain. The first few data points will reduce uncertainty more for a highly uncertain variable than it would be for a more certain variable. So the way to think of it is if you know almost nothing, almost anything will tell you something. That's the quote. That's my phrase now. I'm going to put a law on that, the law of extreme uncertainties or something like that. I don't know, but it's actually convenient that the highest information value variables, the ones that you haven't been measuring, are high information value because they tend to be highly uncertain, and they're actually easier to measure because they're uncertain, not in spite of it.
Right.
The fact that they're uncertain makes them easier to reduce that uncertainty. You've got so much uncertainty that even a few observations and a little bit of math will greatly reduce it.
So you can make significant improvements by sort of.
Oh, sure. If you said, I have no idea what percentage of my employees are following a procedure correctly, or what percentage of my customers will buy a new product I developed, or something like this. If you said you had no idea, maybe your best way to start is say it's somewhere between 0 and 100%, right? That's like saying you have no idea, right? It can't be less than 0%, can't be more than 100, but then you say everything in between is equally likely.
Right.
Well, there's a way to do the math on that. How many people would I have to sample at random out of the population to reduce that uncertainty by half? The answer is about 9.
Yeah.
That's not many.
Right.
Even marginal reductions in uncertainty can be worth millions of dollars. What would it be worth to a bank to have 1% less loan decision error? So there would be 1% less frequently they would accept a bad loan or reject what would have been a good loan. Well, millions of dollars easily every year, 1% less. So even marginal reductions in uncertainty can be very useful. And the marginal reductions in uncertainty are very easy to get for those highly uncertain variables. So, so I tell people, look, if you don't know how to measure something that's high information value, if that information value, I've seen information values on major policy decisions, variables on individual policy decisions that are easily hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars.
Yeah.
If you have an information value on a variable that's $1 million, and then I would say, well, what do you think it's worth to learn how to measure that? Do you think it really take you more than a couple of weeks to figure that out?
Right. No, it's a very powerful perspective, I think, that we have the most to gain from engaging with these seemingly complex and hard to quantify issues, because that's where we can make the most progress and have, new relevant data or information for our decisions. So I think that's something we should try to make a habit out of, and get over ourselves, because we always, like we said before, we gravitate towards the easy to verify things. So it's a good corrective to current practice, I'd say. But Doug, let me ask also. I think I speak for a lot of viewers here when I wonder. Let's say we have identified a major risk, like some dam bursting or some cyber attack, and we get the biggest brains in the house together, and we look at, we talk about it, and we converge on a view that there's a 5% probability, and the impact would be 200 million of, if this were to happen. Have we made an error, or did we go wrong here, by just sitting down?
First off, you wouldn't say there's a 5% chance of 200 million. You'd say there's a 5% chance of the event occurring, and if it occurs, I'm 90% sure the loss will be between 40 million and 400 million. That's the way you would say it, on a log normal distribution or something like this, right? So the question is, if I look at the data, how often did the event occur of all the times that somebody said something was 5% likely? That's the way you want to think about it, not this individual event, right? Yeah. You look at all events that way, right? So if you said, but groups of people throughout the entire organization over the course of a year said things were 5% likely 1,000 times, then, and these were things that were forecasted to have happened or not by the end of that year, then by the end of the year, you should have observed that about 50 out of 1,000 occurred, plus or minus a few. Yeah. If you want to compute a statistically allowable error around that. And so, that's real easy to do. We have tons of data on exactly that. What is the performance of subject matter experts forecast? Right. So that's something where that's the set of data where I'm telling people you have more data than you think, and you need less data than you think, right? And by the way, and we've kind of talked on this a little bit, the third thing I tell people, there's a pretty good chance it's been measured before. No matter what you're measuring. You want to talk about the rates of disasters at nuclear power plants. Do we have no data on that? No. We actually have thousands of reactor years of data. So you take all the reactors, a couple hundred or so, a few hundred reactors around the world, times the number of years on average that they've been around. So it's actually thousands of reactor years of data. And we've observed some events during the course of that. So as a baseline, and this is strictly a baseline, it's a starting point, I would simply look at out of 10,000 reactor years, I don't know how many reactor years total there are. We've observed, these kinds of events 10 times. So there's a 1 in 1,000 chance per reactor per year of that happening. Now, if you think that sounds too low or too high, it must be because you actually have more data than just the 10,000 reactor years of experience. Or Deepwater Horizon, the big oil rig that blew up in the Gulf of Mexico and caused a giant oil spill. There are, again, thousands of rig years of data. You look at all the oil rigs and the number of years they've been in service and the number of events that have occurred. There are thousands of data points, thousands of rig years. For cybersecurity, thousands of data points for company years of data. So we observe, let's say, just look at the Fortune 500. Fortune 500 companies over the last 10 years. Well, that's 5,000 company years of data. How many times out of the Fortune 500 did a cybersecurity event occur? That would be a baseline. And that's a good place to start.
But what if it's a good place to start. I agree. I think the tendency people have is to look at the specifics of their, let's say, dam now, not rather than reactors. They will, and they wonder, will this dam burst? And they, rather than looking around the world, and the dam years and the number of accidents and etc., they would look at what's going on in this area. What's the rainfall and what's this particular type of concrete, and everything gets very. And that's the wrong way to go then, you would say.
Yes, that's right. In fact, Daniel Kahneman wrote about that. He was differentiating between taking the inside view and the outside view of risk. The inside view is where we look at each thing like it's unique. I call it the uniqueness fallacy. If everything really was unique, then our experience is based on nothing, because we could never extrapolate from any previous experiences to new experiences. People's experience means nothing if that's true. The only reason your experience matters is because you believe you can make inferences from past heterogeneous observations to future ones, okay? So the outside view is to look at populations of data like that, like the dam years, and say, well, maybe there's categories of dams, right? So obviously there's different structures of dams, different sizes and so forth. And so you look at, let's say 100 similar dams and they tend to be around a long time, over say a 20-year period, because dam technology, I don't think has changed a lot. Maybe concrete strengthening methods have evolved, I think. But, I think dams are dams. Ultimately, for the past few decades, that's been the case. So you've got 100 dams over 20 years, that's 2,000 dam years. How many times did a dam fail? Well, if it failed, twice, that's a 1 in 1,000 chance per dam per year of failing. And if somebody says that's too high or too low for this particular dam, it's because they know more about that dam. That dam, do they have reason to believe it's safer than other dams or less safe than other dams? A lot of times people will say, yes, but we're taking extra precautions on our dam, or we're taking extra cybersecurity precautions in our company so we can't extrapolate from everybody else because we're taking these extra precautions. Well, wait a second. What precautions do you think the other firms were lacking? Do you know what controls they had in place? Unless we know something about the controls the other firms had in place, why do I think I'm different? That's why a baseline is a better place to start. And again, by the way, so what if I said I'm not going to use quantitative models? I'm just going to say it's a a low or a green risk.
Right.
That didn't alleviate any of those issues. People will ask fewer questions because they get the analysis placebo effect, and they feel more confident. Oh, well, we said green, so I guess that constitutes analysis, and we all feel better. So that's all we really wanted, was to feel better. Because we're in risk analysis, by definition, as I mentioned earlier, we're talking about relatively rare events. So if you kind of phone this one in a little bit, you're probably not going to find out about it for a while, which is typically what people observe, right?
Right. Yeah. So focusing on the right sources of uncertainty here is something we need to get better at. Another example from a Swedish bakery a few years back, it burned down because a piece of dough had caught fire, and that created this disaster. So that gave a certain outlandish feel to the whole thing, like piece of dough burning up. But that's not where to focus, right? I mean, as a corporate risk manager looking forward, we should still be trying to quantify factory fires, right? I mean, that's still the relevant outcome. So we shouldn't be caught up in these.
Yeah, I think if you actually get into very specific causes, well, then your reference class, when I was talking about company years or DAM years, you would call that a reference class. That's a population that you draw experiences from which you estimate your baseline based on the number of times that occurred in that reference class. Right. If you wanted to refine your reference class and look at all the times that the food products themselves caused a restaurant fire, a bakery fire, and it burned to the ground, well, that's a very small reference class. But the fact is that I bet a lot of the causes were unusual causes. Where I live, I'm out in the suburbs of Chicago. There's a major airport several miles away, not nearly close enough that I ever hear a plane. But there's a chance, I suppose, I could be killed by a falling plane part. Now, if I do get killed by a falling part off of a plane sometime, was my insurance company's models all wrong because they failed to predict that particular cause? Again, they're holding a higher standard to the algorithm than they would to any qualitative model. I mean, qualitatively and intuitively, people didn't predict that outcome either. But the insurance company doesn't have to do that. They just have to say, well, here's his overall chance of death per year, or to make a health claim per year, right? And here's the distribution of health claims. So again, I think that kind of comes back to that uniqueness fallacy. I also sometimes call it the fallacy of close analogy. So the fallacy of close analogy is that only highly analogous situations can be informative. Again, if that were true, then most of our experience is not relevant for most forecasts we would ever make. Yeah. Regardless of whether or not our risk analysis is qualitative or not. If everything's unique, then nothing can be extrapolated to anything else, qualitatively, quantitatively, or otherwise.
I think that's a major sticking point here in firms. They are caught up in that story that this is uniquely unique, and that prevents them from making the kind of progress they could be making if they were to take the broader view and have what's the reactor years rather than our specific plant, right? So that's food for thought. But another question, Doug, how far can we take this then, just to clarify your view on that? Like, now we're venturing even further into the black swan territory here. Like, let's say we're concerned about the collapse of the US dollar, let's say, and the central banking system. We haven't really seen a lot of that. Maybe would you still stick to your guns here and say that we should collect data on currency collapses in history? And
sure, we have tons of data on that, and I don't know why I wouldn't stick to my guns, because I certainly don't put a 0% probability on it. If I don't put a 0% probability on it, then the outcome one way or the other doesn't prove me wrong. Again, you just have to look at all the times I said something was 1% likely or something like this. On a per year probability, I guess the first naive baseline I would do is I would just look at the history of currencies.
Right.
What's the average rate of collapse per currency per year, right? Yeah. That's some percentage. I don't know what, a very interesting question. I don't know what the answer would be. I'm sure historically we've got a lot of data on this. Then we might say, okay, that's the naive approach, but I could make a slightly better estimate. Maybe I can say, well, it's a function of how widely used a currency is. So maybe there's a relationship between how widely used a currency is and its rate of collapse. Okay, so I make a further adjustment. There's a very interesting rule that I use quite a lot. It's called Laplace's rule of succession. For somebody who wants to look into it in greater detail, it's actually the mean of what's called a beta distribution. Okay, but Pierre-Simon Laplace figured this out quite a while ago. Okay, suppose I'm trying to estimate the chance of the US dollar collapsing. And all I know is it so far hasn't collapsed over, well, I don't know how far back I can go because we didn't always have a centralized US dollar. We had, banknotes for quite a while. So I don't know how far back you would necessarily go for a US dollar, but let's say, post Civil War or something like this, right? So let's say, 160 years or something to that effect. Laplace's rule of succession would say if I'm observing something and it doesn't happen, and the only data I have is that it hasn't happened yet, I can still make an inference on the chance of it happening in the next round, the next year, for example. So it's similar to this. I'm drawing from an urn. There's marbles in this urn. And all I know is at the beginning, there were somewhere between 0% and 100% of the marbles in the urn were red. The remainder are green. Okay, I'm making a sample every day or every hour, whatever it is. I'm sampling these marbles. And at first, all I knew is it's somewhere between 0 and 100% red. I keep sampling marbles and I sample 8 in a row. The first 8 are all green. What's the chance the next one will be red? Well, a lot of people would say you have no data on that yet. No, that's not true. I've actually stated everything you need to know to figure out that it's actually a 10% chance, because I stated a prior, there's a Bayesian approach to this, and this thing called the beta distribution is actually a Bayesian application. It's actually an extension of Bayes. You can derive a beta distribution from Bayes' theorem alone. And Laplace's rule of succession is just the mean of a beta distribution. So every time I sample something, I'm reducing my uncertainty about the proportion of red marbles, which is still a range. The proportion of red marbles is still a range to me, right? But the chance that the next marble I draw, that specific marble is red, that's just the mean of the beta distribution, right? So that would be the average of all the probable proportions, right? That makes sense, right? I mean, if I think there's a 50% chance that there's a 20% red and there's a 50% chance that there's 40% red, well, then my chance of drawing a red marble is 30%. It's the middle of the two, right? Obviously. So Laplace's rule of succession couldn't be simpler. All it is 1 plus the number of hits over 2 plus sample size. That's all it is. So if my sample size is 8 and I've got no hits, if I call red a hit, then 1 plus 0 over 2 plus 8, 1 over 10, 10%. A lot of times people say, well, how do I work out the chance of this? This came up during one of our enterprise risk management clients. Somebody said, this facility, this data center is next to a major highway, and periodically, not necessarily on that highway, but in other places in the country or near a railhead, something like a big ammonia tank, burst and falls on the highway and causes lots of problems. You have to evacuate an area. And somebody said, well, that's a chance because it happened with this other company in this other area once. I go, well, okay. How long have you been here? 20 years. Have you observed that happen yet here? No. So let's apply Laplace's rule of succession. 1 over 2 plus 20, 1 over 22, a little less than 5%, right? That would be their baseline. Then I would say, does that sound too high or too low? They say, well, actually, that probably sounds high. Well, why does it sound high? It's because their reference class is larger than just their personal experience at that facility. They actually are using other historical knowledge, maybe historical knowledge from other, or something about the rate of these kinds of events on highways. per mile of highway per year. What's the rate of that event? And so then they were able to zero in on it faster. So Laplace's rule of succession is always a great starting point for us, even when they feel like they've got no data other than they haven't seen it yet. Yeah. Even if you haven't seen it yet, that tells us something.
Right. Yeah. I see that. That's a nice point, and we're always trying to anchor things in the decision sciences here. That's the general approach. But I have to say, though, that in the case of the collapsing dollar, the uniqueness fallacy is really making itself felt, right? Because you're starting to think that this is a globalized economy, which we've never had before, and it's the reserve currency in that economy, and you keep adding all these unique characteristics, right? And you end up discounting the historical data points, right? But there's never a situation where you would fall for the temptation to sort of just go for, some expert view, that you find some knowledgeable person and they will come up with some estimate of
yeah. Well, first off, I don't think there's a 0% chance of the collapse of the US dollar. There's not the fact that it hasn't collapsed yet. Isn't all the data I have. For all the reasons you were just talking about, I certainly would not, misinterpret historical observations and commit the uniqueness fallacy here, that the US dollar is unique and therefore it's the one currency that can't collapse. I don't know that. There's no reason I would have for that. 1% means once in a century. In terms of the that's one way to think about it. Once in a century. Could something like that happen in the course of a century? I don't know why it couldn't. What would keep something like that from happening once a century? And if I think it's less likely than 1%, it's only because we have a lot of currencies, a history of currencies since the beginning of banking systems. Let's say that's our reference class, is look at just the beginning of banking systems in general, where they've had, standardized currencies of various sorts, especially that weren't necessarily gold backed or anything like this. I don't know if that would make any difference at all, by the way. But because even gold depends on people's perceived value of it. So, so that's no guarantee either. But if it's not 1%, it's still not 0%. I have no reason to believe it would be 0% chance of occurring. We have plenty of data on the chance that a really catastrophic meteor strike would destroy a large percentage of the world population. We know a lot about that, actually, even though we haven't observed it in human history. We know that because we can see the size of craters on the moon. And we can observe something about the frequency of the craters by how much the craters overlap. We can see all that. And so NASA's actually done an analysis of the magnitude and frequency of different meteor strikes. And, it's interesting. You could probably look at the oldest cities on the planet, the very oldest civilizations where there's still a city standing. How many of them are actually on a coast? Not many. They tend to be pretty inland. They might be on the coast of a smaller body of water like the Mediterranean, but they're not on the coast of the Pacific, and they're not on the coast of the Atlantic. Why is that? Well, one possible explanation is that where meteors, when they do strike, they're more likely to hit the Atlantic or the Pacific, and than any other body of water, and closer to the equator, because we know something about near-Earth objects, and the Mediterranean is a less likely chance of being hit, not just because it's a much smaller area, but it's up higher latitude than the equator. So we have all of this interesting data. NASA's come up with this great forecast on this. So, and for all I know, the Yellowstone caldera will blow anytime. Not very likely, probably not in my lifetime or even the next couple hundred years, but the Yellowstone caldera could blow. It's a super volcano, if you're not familiar with it, that could probably destroy the United States and destroy agriculture for most of the world if it ever does happen. So I don't put a 0% chance on those events.
But what does that mean for decision making? I mean, if the probability tends towards zero, it's not zero, but it's pretty close. What are we to make of that? I mean, because when the probability is almost zero, the cost of that risk also goes towards zero, unless the cost is somehow infinite, right?
Yeah, well, actually, the way to think about it is that those rarest events that we're still interested in do tend to be more catastrophic, so their impact is much larger. They don't have to be, the impact doesn't have to be infinite. It just has to be much larger to still maintain our interest in this. And because we tend to be risk averse, there's models for that, of course. Expected utility theory and things like this give us some basis for thinking about our aversion to risk. We don't necessarily equate a 1% chance of losing $100 million to a 10% chance of losing $10 million or a certainty of losing $1 million. We actually, because we're risk averse, we're actually more concerned about a 1% chance of losing 100 million than a 10% chance of losing 10 million or a certain loss of $1 million because we're risk averse.
Because of the collateral damage that can create. Like if you're
even more fundamentally, just our preferences on risk and return. Assuming those numbers have all the collateral damage all figured in. So everything you want to monetize is in those numbers already. Let's assume that for a moment. This is the fact that I would not equate those three cases, 100% chance of losing $1 million, 10% chance of losing 10 million, a 1% chance of losing 100 million, is not because I am excluding costs from some and not others. Let's assume I'm including it. It's because of risk aversion, the natural consequence of risk aversion of individuals. In other words, you probably would not equate getting $100,000 cash to a 10% chance of winning $1 million.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you wouldn't be indifferent between those, would you?
No, but I'm an individual. I think when you look at this from a firm's perspective, they're actually, if you go by the theory, supposed to make their decisions according to expected value. I mean, they're supposed to be risk neutral.
No, that's actually just one theory. Because if their individual estimates are small compared to the whole portfolio, and you can work this out. I was working on this morning because I was actually just working out a template for new expected utility and expected value problems just within the last few hours here. On very small investments relative to the size of the entire organization, you do approach expected value. But for the few biggest decisions, it's actually expected utility. And so if you want to extrapolate that situation that I just gave you, the $100,000 per share versus 10% chance of winning $1 million, well, just add a few more zeros to each of them to make it more relevant to the corporation. And then you start to observe, because I've actually done workshops where we've quantified the risk aversion of upper level decision makers, including boards of directors at lots of organizations. And they are not expected value decision makers. They are expected utility decision makers.
You might argue that there's a sense in which they should focus on the expected value of cash flows in the future rather than think about their own risk aversion. I mean, they are supposed to maximize shareholder value, right? Which is
wait, shareholders aren't risk neutral either.
No, but now we're entering a financial theory here. You know, if they're diversified or not, but I mean, but
it's not a function of diversification. I'm saying that even if someone is diversified, they still end up trading off return for certainty of return. So if somebody says, I've got an investment that's a 5% average annualized return with a standard deviation of 1%, they are not indifferent between that and a 5% annual standard deviation of return, average return with a standard deviation of 5%.
Yeah.
They do not equate those two. They are actually willing to pay a premium for reduced uncertainty, and we see this all over all the investment portfolios. The modern portfolio theory and all portfolio management methods are based on this idea that you make risk-return trade-offs. It's not expected value. It's only expected value if you are assuming that each bet is relatively small compared to the whole portfolio, but you're still risk averse to the whole portfolio.
Well, this is an interesting debate. I mean, the thing here is that if the goal is to maximize expected cash flow, you you're not supposed to have a preference or in terms of the distribution of cash flows. It's only the average, the expectation that matters for decision making, unless there's some penalty risk.
Yeah, that's apparently not true though.
No. I mean, but that's how they behave. But they may not be supposed to behave that way if you were to strictly go.
No, even how they behave is not based on expected value. You can tell by looking at how much people discount the prices of things based on their uncertainty.
I'm not talking about how they behave. I'm talking about how they should behave if you were to, insist on.
Oh, I'm saying even from the point of view of they should behave, whether it's should or how people act in a risk-averse manner. There's perfectly good reasons, there's completely rational reasons to be risk-averse.
There are, and the collateral damage that you get from these losses is reason enough to behave as if you were risk-averse. So I mean, corporate.
But I'm saying you bake all those costs in. We're not ignoring those costs when we talk about risk aversion. We're talking about assuming these are all the costs, whether it's collateral damage cost or not. You say you assume these are all the costs that are relevant. Okay, they're included in the model. People neither behave as their expected value optimizers, nor should they behave as their expected value optimizers, except for these very frequent smaller decisions. Their expected value is a perfectly good model because when you're making bets that are relatively small compared to the entire organization, expected value is the next best thing. But you look.
But the problem here is you have to commit resources, right? I mean, for decision making, you have to. Risk management is rarely free, right? So, what if you're trading real costs here and now for some benefit that is about some very low probability becoming even lower?
I mean that doesn't skip really on risk management. That additional consideration, which should be included, doesn't change whether or not we should use expected value or expected utility kind of approaches. So here's the thing. If we use an expected utility approach, we still turn it into a value. It's still a monetary value that we turn it into. But if I said you're going to win somewhere between $0 and $1 million, based on this uncertain, it's a uniform distribution between $0 and $1 million. An expected value person would say, if I had the option to buy that for $490,000, I would do it because the expected value is $500,000. But most people would not do that. You would not do that. And the only difference between you and the organization is how many zeros are in each of those numbers. That's the only difference, because there's a bet like that that's large enough for the organization for it to say, yeah, I'm not going to bet the organization on that, nor should they. There's a lot of very useful real world examples where if you lost more than X amount, it would be catastrophic, fatal.
Yeah, and that's collateral damage, and I have no problem with that. I mean, then it.
But how is that collateral damage? That's in the distribution of losses. Yeah. I don't exclude it. Why would it be collateral damage? It's one of it. If it's something that's supposed to affect my decision, I include it in the impact.
Yeah, but I mean, you probably start out, putting numbers on your monetary losses, and as long as you're talking pure monetary losses without involving any of the consequences they could bring about.
We've monetized things like the value of a human life and saving endangered species and drought resilience for villages in the Horn of Africa. Right. We've monetized all of that. We've monetized things like which infrastructure investment should we prioritize in Haiti. That was our second United Nations project. How do we monetize the health effects of restoring the Kabuchi Desert in Inner Mongolia, or the societal impacts of 11 dams on the Mekong River? These are all studies we've done.
Right.
So what the fact is that people routinely monetize these things, even when they deny it. Mm-hmm. Even when somebody says, we don't monetize the value of a human life, you can't do that. Well, they've done it many times over. You've monetized the value of your own life, because there are choices you've made where you traded off the use of some resources right now versus slightly reducing your own risk of death next year.
Yeah.
And there are choices you decided not to make that bet, not to take that investment, which is fine. I have too. I could spend more money on a car with a slightly better safety record. A Tesla apparently does fantastic in all the crash tests. I don't own a Tesla. If I really cared about minimizing my chance of death in a car accident, I guess I'd go buy a Tesla, as you would too, if that were the case. But there's a limit to how much either of us are willing to spend from our time and money to reduce even our own risk of death. That's actually called the value of statistical life, or VSL. And most people, on average, act as if they value their lives at about $11 million. So we actually use those numbers when we've done models for utility companies where, there's a risk of a major fire breaking out a utility and a wire goes down and someone in the public is electrocuted, or a worker is electrocuted, or something like this. Those are in our models, and they're as monetary losses. And that's in addition to civil liabilities. Civil liability is a whole other thing. We're talking about just the value of human life itself. And whenever I've had military clients, United Nations clients, utility clients that say, well, we can't put a value on human life. We're not going to do that. I'm saying, I'm not arguing that you should. I'm just arguing that you've always been doing it.
Yeah.
You're just now finally being explicit, because another thing that we can tell you about portfolio optimization methods is when you're not explicit about the cost of decisions, you make inconsistent decisions, and that actually sub-optimizes the performance of your portfolio.
That's a very good point, and one of the major takeaways here from today. There have been plenty of them. This has been a fascinating talk, but being honest about the fact that we are operating on some model, except that we find it too scary to go there and explore the assumptions. We need to get over that and stop being explicit and formalize these things. And I think this is a great takeaway and a great insight that you bring to this discussion and to the risk management community, Doug. Is there any way you would like to sum up at this point some important, do's or don'ts, or do you think that, like, if we?
Yeah, I really think just, regardless of what modeling method you're using, and because you are modeling it,
yes,
even if it's our intuition or coin flips or whatever, you're modeling it. How do we know it works? It's not like we're getting immediate, consistent, frequent feedback on this, right? So how do we know what works? We have to look at the broader scope of research on measured studies on what works and what doesn't in terms of estimating things. And there's been plenty. It's been measured before. We have more data than we think, and when we do the math, it turns out we needed less data than we think. And that's what we should take away. Just keep asking the question for any model, including quantitative. How do we know this works?
Right.
That's all I'm asking people to ask.
Yeah. And how do they find the answer to that question? How can they convince themselves?
Oh, well, that was the other couple of things I mentioned. You have more data than you think. It's been measured before, and you need less data than you think. So remember, when it comes to the performance of individual modeling methods, a lot of them have been measured. I cite a lot of those studies, the large studies. Some of these studies are clinical trials that have gone on for years that have more data points than the vaccine trials. The Good Judgment Project went on for 20 years, and it studied 82,000 individual forecasts from a variety of experts in a variety of fields. 82,000 data points where they put probabilities on individual events occurring. That's the Good Judgment Project. It was done by Philip Tetlock. He's the one who concluded that it, quote, "It's impossible to find any domain in which humans clearly outperformed crude extrapolation algorithms, less still sophisticated statistical ones." Right. I've said that quote so often I've memorized that one. That was a big study. We should say the jury is in on these questions.
The jury is in. And I think anybody who's listened to you tonight, Doug, has comes away with feeling more courageous about standing up for these things in the discussions that are bound to come along, and that's great. I think we all needed to hear this, and we will stand firm whenever these things are in doubt in some sort of discussion here going forward. So
think about the history of medicine.
Yeah.
When doctors first came along and said you should wash your hands.
Yeah.
between procedures. That was resisted at first. Fortunately, somebody stuck up for that. That was a new idea at one point. Like a lot of other things in medicine, they were initially resisted, but somebody stood up for it because it worked better. It actually improved public health. And this is really no different.
Right.
So be those brave physicians that started looking at the data.
Yeah, and the rest will come around at some point, and we'll eventually get there. I share your conviction there, Doug. And but we've been talking a long time here, and I could go on forever. This is obviously enjoyable, and we're learning lots here. But I think we need to think about wrapping this up. And once again, thank you so much, Doug. And yeah, once more, where can the listener find more information? You mentioned some websites there. Is that
well, howtomeasureanything.com is the website for my books, howtomeasureanything.com, but also hubbardresearch.com is my company's website, and
right.
There we actually have the AIE Academy, the Applied Information Economics Academy. So there's a list of courses that cover all of this in great detail.
Right. That's an excellent place to go then for further information and to continue to explore these exciting methods here. And yeah, so that's great. We'll leave it there. Thanks. Thank you so much, Doug, and it's been a pleasure. And,
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thanks.
See you soon. Bye-bye.